For nearly 3 years, Jasper and Bandit had been considered the most disciplined K9s at Pine Ridge Training Center in Montana. They never broke formation, never ignored a command, never took their eyes off their handlers during training, not once. Every instructor trusted them. Every officer admired them. Many believed they would become two of the finest police dogs in the state. Then one cold autumn morning, something changed. In the middle of a public demonstration, both German shepherds suddenly stopped. Their ears lifted, their bodies froze, and their eyes locked onto someone standing near the edge of the training field. A few seconds later, they did something no one had ever seen before. They broke formation. At the exact same moment, the crowd gasped. Handlers shouted commands. Neither dog listened. Jasper and Bandit sprinted across the field as if nothing else in the world mattered. Most people thought they were about to attack. Some feared they had lost control. But when the dogs finally reached their destination, they didn't bark. They didn't growl. They didn't lunge. Instead, the two powerful K9s collapsed at the feet of an elderly maintenance worker and began whining softly, as though they had found someone they had been searching for their entire lives. The old man simply looked down at them. Then he raised one hand, a single silent gesture. Both dogs immediately sat at attention, perfectly still, perfectly obedient. The entire training center fell silent. No one knew who the old man really was. No one understood why two elite K9s had reacted that way. But Lieutenant Wade Brennan couldn't stop thinking about what he had witnessed. And when he began searching for answers, he uncovered a forgotten story buried for more than 30 years. A story about a lonely old man, a boy struggling to heal after losing his mother, a police dog named Rusty, and a sacrifice that had never been properly remembered. What Wade discovered would change not only the life of the old maintenance worker, but his own life forever. If this story touches your heart today, please consider sharing it with someone you care about. And if you enjoy stories about loyalty, healing, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe and join us for more unforgettable journeys. It was a cold October morning in Kalispell, Montana. The first light of day stretched across the distant mountains, while a thin layer of frost still covered the training fields of Pine Ridge K9 Training Center. The annual K9 demonstration had drawn a large crowd. Police chiefs, retired officers, local officials, and families filled the viewing stands, eager to watch some of the finest police dogs in the region perform. Lieutenant Wade Brennan, a 44-year-old K9 training director, stood near the center of the field. Wade had spent most of his adult life working with police dogs. Calm under pressure and respected by both officers and handlers, he took pride in maintaining one of the most successful K9 programs in Montana. Today's event was important. Several neighboring departments were attending, and the demonstration would showcase the abilities of Pine Ridge's most accomplished dogs. At the far side of the field stood Jasper and Bandit. Both German shepherds were among the most highly trained K9s in the center's history. Jasper was known for his precision and focus. Bandit was famous for his intelligence and steady temperament. Together, they had become the standard by which younger dogs were measured. Their handlers, Officer Ryan Keller and Officer Marcus Dunn, waited for the signal to begin. Wade glanced across the crowd and gave a short nod. The demonstration started. The first few exercises went perfectly. Jasper cleared obstacles with effortless speed. Bandit followed with flawless obedience work. The audience applauded several times as the dogs responded instantly to every command. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Then something changed. At first, it was so subtle that no one noticed. Jasper froze. His body became rigid. A second later, Bandit did the same. Their ears lifted. Their heads turned toward the far end of the training grounds. Officer Keller frowned. "Jasper." The dog didn't move. Officer Dunn called Bandit's name. No response. Wade immediately sensed something unusual. In all his years of training, he had learned to trust small changes in a dog's behavior. Something had caught their attention. But what? The dogs continued staring toward the outer maintenance gate. Beyond the fence stood a narrow service road. Near that road was an elderly man pushing a maintenance cart loaded with tools. Most people in the crowd barely noticed him. His name was Emmett Grady, 74 years old, part-time maintenance worker. For nearly a year, Emmett had quietly repaired fences, fixed broken lights, and handled small jobs around the facility. He arrived before sunrise and usually left before anyone paid attention to him. He was respected enough, but few people knew anything about him. At that moment, Emmett was carrying a toolbox toward a storage shed. He seemed completely unaware that two elite police dogs were staring directly at him. Then Jasper pulled hard against his leash. Officer Keller nearly lost his balance. "What in the world?" Bandit lunged at the same instant. The audience gasped. Handlers tightened their grips. Both dogs strained forward with surprising force. The commands came immediately. "Jasper, heel! Bandit, stay!" Neither dog listened. For the first time anyone could remember, both K9s completely ignored their handlers. Wade's expression hardened. Something was wrong. Then the impossible happened. The dogs broke free. Jasper slipped from Officer Keller's control first. Bandit followed half a second later. Two powerful German shepherds exploded across the field. The crowd erupted in panic. Several spectators stood up. Parents pulled their children closer. Some people instinctively stepped backward. The dogs were moving at full speed, straight toward the maintenance gate, straight toward Emmett Grady. "Move!" someone shouted. "Get him out of there!" Several officers began running. Wade sprinted after the dogs. His heart pounded. Every possible disaster flashed through his mind. If the dogs attacked someone during a public demonstration, the consequences would be enormous. But Emmett did something nobody expected. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He didn't even step backward. Instead, the old man simply turned around. His weathered face remained calm. For a brief moment, his eyes met the approaching dogs. Jasper reached him first. The crowd collectively held its breath. Then the German shepherd did something that made no sense. Rather than jumping or barking, Jasper slowed. His tail began wagging. Bandit arrived beside him. Both dogs circled the old man once. Then they dropped to the ground at his feet. The massive police dogs began whining softly. Not aggressive sounds, not fearful sounds. They sounded emotional, almost relieved. Jasper pressed his head against Emmett's leg. Bandit lowered his body and rested his chin on the old man's boot. The audience fell silent. Nobody moved. Nobody understood what they were seeing. Even Wade stopped several yards away. The dogs behaved as though they had just found someone deeply important to them. But that was impossible. Emmett wasn't a trainer. He wasn't a handler. He wasn't even involved with the K9 program, or so everyone believed. The old man looked down at the dogs. For the first time, genuine surprise appeared on his face. His eyes softened. A strange sadness seemed to pass across his expression. Then something even stranger happened. Almost without thinking, Emmett lifted one hand. It wasn't a standard command. None of the handlers recognized it. The motion was small and precise, a simple hand signal. Jasper immediately sat. Bandit sat beside him. Perfect posture, perfect focus, perfect obedience. The transformation was instant. Both dogs became completely still. It was as though they had spent years practicing that exact signal. A stunned silence settled over the entire training center. Officer Keller looked at Officer Dunn. Neither man had any explanation. Wade slowly approached. His attention remained fixed on Emmett. The old maintenance worker seemed just as confused as everyone else. But there was something else. For a brief second, Wade thought he saw emotion in the old man's eyes. Not fear. Not pride. Recognition. The moment passed quickly. Emmett lowered his hand. Jasper and Bandit remained seated. Neither dog attempted to move. Neither dog looked away from him. The crowd began whispering. Questions spread through the stands. Who was this man? Why had the dogs reacted this way? How did he know a command nobody else recognized? Wade looked from the dogs to the old maintenance worker. Years of experience told him this was not a coincidence. Something connected Emmett Grady to those dogs. Something hidden. Something important. And for the first time since Emmett had arrived at Pine Ridge, Wade Brennan realized he knew absolutely nothing about the old man standing in front of him. The strange incident with Jasper and Bandit became the only topic anyone discussed at Pine Ridge K9 Training Center for the rest of the week. Handlers replayed the moment in their minds. Officers debated possible explanations during lunch breaks. Some believed the dogs had somehow recognized a scent. Others thought there must have been an unseen command, yet none of the theories truly explained what everyone had witnessed. The only person who seemed uninterested in the attention was Emmett Grady. The morning after the demonstration, he arrived at the center before sunrise, just as he always did. The parking lot was still dark when his old pickup truck rolled through the maintenance entrance. He parked beside a storage building, collected his toolbox, and began his work without saying much to anyone. At 74 years old, Emmett moved more slowly than he once had, but he never complained. He repaired loose fence panels, checked kennel gates, replaced worn hinges, and fixed whatever needed attention. Most people greeted him politely before returning to their own responsibilities. Few knew anything about him. Even fewer cared enough to ask. By mid-morning, the training center had returned to its normal rhythm. Dogs barked in the distance. Trainers moved through exercises. Patrol vehicles arrived and departed throughout the day. From a distance, Emmett looked like part of the facility itself, as familiar and unnoticed as the fences he repaired. Lieutenant Wade Brennan found himself watching the old man more often than he intended. The image of Jasper and Bandit sitting perfectly still beneath Emmett's raised hand refused to leave his thoughts. Wade had spent more than 20 years working with police dogs. Dogs could recognize scents. Dogs could remember people. Dogs could form strong attachments. But Jasper and Bandit had never met Emmett before. At least that was what Wade believed. Yet the certainty he normally relied upon was beginning to crack. Several times that week, he considered approaching Emmett directly. Each time he changed his mind. Something told him the old man would simply dismiss his questions. Meanwhile, Wade's life outside the training center remained far more complicated than anything happening with the dogs. His son Luke was becoming increasingly distant. Luke Brennan was 13 years old. Before his mother's illness, he had been energetic, curious, and constantly asking questions. Since her death 2 years earlier, much of that spark had disappeared. The house felt quieter now. Luke spent more time alone in his room. Meals often passed with only a few words exchanged. Wade understood why. The loss hurt him too. But while Wade buried himself in work, Luke seemed to retreat deeper into himself with every passing month. One evening, Wade knocked gently on his son's bedroom door. "You want to grab dinner in town tomorrow?" he asked. Luke barely looked up from the book resting in his lap. "Maybe." The answer was polite, but it carried no enthusiasm. Wade stood there for a moment before quietly walking away. The distance between them felt larger than ever. A few days later, Pine Ridge hosted a small family visitation event. Officers brought spouses, children, and relatives to tour parts of the facility. It was an annual tradition meant to help families better understand the work being done at the center. Wade convinced Luke to come. At first, the teenager showed little interest. He walked beside his father without saying much while groups toured training fields and kennel areas. Several children laughed and pointed excitedly at the dogs. Luke remained silent. Then something unexpected happened. Near the rear maintenance shed, he noticed Emmett repairing a damaged latch on a kennel gate. The old man was kneeling beside a toolbox, carefully tightening a bolt. A young German Shepherd trainee stood quietly nearby, watching him. Unlike many of the energetic puppies at the center, this one seemed unusually calm around Emmett. Luke slowed his pace. For several seconds he simply watched. Emmett eventually noticed him standing there. The old man offered a small smile. "Morning?" Luke hesitated, then nodded. "Morning?" The conversation should have ended there. Normally it would have. Instead, Luke found himself lingering. The puppy walked over and sat beside Emmett. Without looking, the old man reached down and scratched behind its ears. The dog immediately relaxed. "Why does he follow you everywhere?" Luke asked. Emmett chuckled softly. "I fixed his kennel door a few weeks ago." Luke frowned. "That's all? Maybe?" The old man smiled. "Or maybe he just likes the company." For the first time in months, Luke gave a faint smile. It lasted only a second, but it was there. Emmett noticed. He didn't mention it. Instead, he returned to tightening the latch. Luke remained nearby. A few moments later, he spoke again. "Do you work here every day?" "Most days." "You like it?" Emmett thought for a moment. "Yeah. Why?" The question seemed simple, yet Emmett's answer came slowly. "I like being around dogs." There was something in his voice that caught Luke's attention, something deeper than the words themselves. The teenager sat on a nearby wooden crate. The puppy settled beside his feet. For nearly 20 minutes, they talked about dogs. Nothing serious, nothing personal. Just stories about training, behavior, and the strange habits different dogs developed. To anyone passing by, it looked like an ordinary conversation. But for Luke, it felt different. For the first time in many months, he found himself genuinely interested in talking to someone. When Wade eventually returned looking for his son, he stopped several yards away. Luke was speaking, not just answering questions, actually speaking. The sight surprised him. He hadn't seen his son engage with anyone that openly since before his wife's death. As they prepared to leave, Luke glanced back toward the maintenance shed. Emmett raised a hand in farewell. Luke waved back. The gesture was small, yet Wade noticed it immediately. That evening, after Luke went upstairs, Wade remained seated at the kitchen table, thinking about what he had witnessed. The old maintenance worker clearly carried some kind of connection to dogs, maybe more than anyone realized. The next day, curiosity finally pushed Wade to act. He began searching through old storage records kept in the administrative building. Most files dated back decades. Dust covered many of the boxes. Hours passed. Folders accumulated on the table around him. Then, near the bottom of a forgotten archive box, Wade discovered an old photograph. The edges were faded. The colors had nearly disappeared. He carefully brushed away a layer of dust. The image showed a much younger man standing beside a German shepherd. Several officers appeared in the background. A handwritten note on the back identified the year. Wade stared at the photograph. The younger man was unmistakable. Even after all these years, it was Emmett Grady, and beside him stood a German shepherd wearing an old K9 vest. Printed beneath the photograph was a single name, Rusty. Wade felt a chill move through him. For the first time, he realized the old maintenance worker might not simply be a forgotten employee. He might be part of a story that nobody at Pine Ridge remembered anymore. The photograph stayed on Wade Brennan's desk for 2 days. Whenever he found a spare moment between training schedules, handler evaluations, and administrative meetings, his eyes drifted back to the faded image. A younger Emmett Grady stood beside a German shepherd named Rusty. The man in the photograph looked different, stronger, more confident. There was a sense of purpose in his posture that Wade had never seen in the quiet maintenance worker who repaired fences and replaced broken latches around Pine Ridge. Something about the picture refused to leave his mind. On the third morning, Wade carried the photograph into the administrative archive room. The building contained decades of records dating back to the earliest years of the center. Most of the files had never been digitized. Many sat untouched inside filing cabinets that had not been opened in years. Wade spent hours searching. Old training manuals, evaluation reports, program proposals, retired officer records. At first, nothing stood out. Then he found a document from the late 1980s. The cover page immediately caught his attention. The title described a series of advanced K9 communication techniques. The author listed beneath it was Emmett Grady. Wade frowned. He opened the folder. Inside were pages of detailed notes explaining hand signals, silent directional commands, tracking communication methods, and handler positioning systems. Much of it felt strangely familiar, because Pine Ridge still used many of those same concepts today. Not exactly as written, not word for word. But the foundation was clearly there. The deeper Wade looked, the more examples he found. Training procedures, field communication methods, behavior assessment guidelines, all carrying Emmett's name. The discovery left him unsettled. How could someone contribute so much and be almost completely forgotten? By lunchtime, Wade had assembled a small stack of documents. Every file pointed to the same conclusion. Emmett had played a major role during the development of Pine Ridge's K9 program. Yet when Wade opened the center's official historical records, a different name appeared repeatedly: Captain Vernon Pierce. Pierce was widely recognized as one of the founders of the program. His photograph hung in the administration building. His achievements were mentioned during training courses. Several facilities had been named after him. The official history described him as the driving force behind Pine Ridge's success. Yet the document sitting on Wade's desk suggested a more complicated story. The more he read, the more questions emerged. That afternoon, Wade visited Harold Simmons, a 72-year-old retired K9 handler who occasionally volunteered at community events. Harold had worked at Pine Ridge decades earlier and was one of the few people still around from that era. When Wade showed him the photograph, Harold adjusted his glasses and stared quietly for several seconds. A faint smile appeared. "I haven't seen this picture in years." "You knew him?" Wade asked. Everybody knew Emmett back then. Harold leaned back in his chair. He lived and breathed K9 work. Wade pointed toward the photograph. "And Rusty?" The old man chuckled softly. "That dog followed him everywhere." For a moment it seemed as if Harold might continue. Instead, he became unusually quiet. Wade noticed the change immediately. "What happened?" Harold looked down at the photograph. "Some stories aren't mine to tell." The answer only deepened the mystery. When Wade returned to the training center, he found himself studying Emmett more closely than ever. The old man was repairing a damaged gate near the eastern training field. Nothing about him suggested someone who had once helped shape the center's future. Emmett noticed Wade approaching and offered a polite nod. "Afternoon, Lieutenant." "Afternoon." Wade hesitated. Then he held up the photograph. For the first time since they had met, genuine surprise crossed Emmett's face. Only for a second. Then it disappeared. "Found this in storage," Wade said. Emmett looked at the picture. His eyes lingered on Rusty. A strange softness appeared in his expression. "You were younger then." "Most people were." A faint smile touched Wade's face. "You wrote a lot of the training material we still use." Emmett returned his attention to the gate latch. "That was a long time ago." "You helped build this place." Emmett tightened a bolt. The metal clicked softly. "Places get built by a lot of people." "Were you one of them?" The old man remained silent. Several seconds passed. The wind moved gently across the field. In the distance, dogs barked during a tracking exercise. Finally, Emmett stood up. "I've got work to finish." His tone remained polite. But the conversation was over. Wade watched him walk away. The refusal felt deliberate, not angry, not defensive. More like someone closing a door he had no desire to reopen. Meanwhile, Luke Brennan found himself thinking about the photograph almost as much as his father. Since meeting Emmett, he had begun spending more time around the training center. The old man never treated him like a child. He never forced conversations. He simply listened. That alone made him different from most adults Luke knew. Several days later, Luke found Emmett repairing a section of fencing behind the kennel area. The teenager leaned against a post while the old man worked. "Can I ask you something?" "You just did." Luke smiled. Emmett rarely joked, but when he did, it always caught him off guard. Luke hesitated. Then he pointed toward the picture he had seen earlier. "Who was Rusty?" The movement of Emmett's hand stopped, only for a moment. Then he continued working. "A dog." Luke waited. Nothing else came. "A special dog?" A longer silence followed. The old man secured the final bolt and slowly straightened his back. "Every dog is special to somebody." Luke sensed there was more, a lot more. But he also sensed pushing would not help. The subject changed naturally after that. They talked about puppies in training, tracking exercises, the strange habits dogs developed when they were bored. Yet throughout the conversation, Luke noticed something. Whenever Rusty's name surfaced, a shadow seemed to pass across Emmett's face. Not sadness exactly. Something deeper, something older. As the afternoon sun began dropping behind the mountains, Luke helped collect a few tools. The kennel area had grown quiet. Most of the handlers had already gone home. The teenager carried a toolbox while Emmett locked a storage cabinet. Then a question entered his mind. It arrived so suddenly he spoke before fully thinking it through. "Mr. Grady?" Emmett glanced up. "Yeah?" Luke shifted his weight. His voice softened. "Did you ever have a best friend?" The question hung in the cool evening air. For a long moment, Emmett said nothing. His eyes moved toward the distant mountains beyond the training fields. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "Yes." Luke waited. Emmett looked down at the toolbox in the boy's hands. Then he smiled sadly. "And he had 4 legs." The answer was simple, but something about it carried decades of memory. Luke didn't ask another question. For the first time, he understood that Rusty had been more than a police dog. Much more. And standing there beside the old maintenance worker, he realized there were stories hidden beneath the silence, stories that had never truly been forgotten. The question lingered in Luke Brennan's mind long after that evening. And he had 4 legs. Emmett Grady had spoken those words quietly, yet they carried more weight than almost anything the old man had said before. Over the next several days, Luke found himself spending more time around the maintenance areas of Pine Ridge K9 Training Center. He helped carry tools, held flashlights while Emmett repaired gates, and occasionally sat nearby while the old man worked in silence. Neither of them seemed to mind the quiet. In fact, Luke had begun to appreciate it. Most adults filled silence with advice. Emmett filled it with patience. One chilly afternoon, clouds drifted low over the Montana mountains, while a light wind moved through the training grounds. The day's exercises had ended early, and most handlers had already returned to their offices. Luke found Emmett sitting on a wooden bench near an unused training field. The old man held a mug of coffee in his hands. For several minutes, they simply watched a group of young K9 recruits being loaded into transport vehicles. Then Luke finally asked the question that had been waiting inside his mind. What was Rusty like? Emmett didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the distant field. A faint smile appeared, not a happy smile, a remembering smile. Rusty wasn't what people expected. Luke waited. When I first met him, nobody thought he'd make it through training. That surprised the teenager. Why? Emmett let out a soft breath. Because he was afraid. Luke frowned. A police dog was afraid? Very. The answer came without hesitation. Emmett shifted slightly on the bench. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't confident. Loud noises startled him. New environments made him nervous. During evaluations, he avoided confrontation whenever possible. Luke looked genuinely confused. Then why was he in the program? He almost wasn't. The old man's voice grew quieter. Back then, the instructors wanted strong dogs, fast dogs, bold dogs, dogs that showed natural confidence. He paused. Rusty wasn't any of those things. Luke watched him carefully. For the first time, Emmett seemed willing to talk about the past. The evaluation board reviewed him 3 separate times. What happened? They recommended removing him from the program. Luke stared. They wanted to get rid of him? They thought he lacked the instincts needed for K9 work. The old man's gaze drifted toward the mountains. One instructor called him a waste of resources. The words hung in the air. Luke felt something tighten inside his chest. He knew what it felt like to believe people were disappointed in you. He knew what it felt like to think you weren't enough. What did you do? He asked. Emmett smiled faintly. I disagreed. The answer seemed simple, yet Luke sensed how much had depended on that decision. The old man leaned forward slightly. Most people only saw what Rusty couldn't do. What did you see? Emmett looked down at his coffee. I saw what he could become. The words settled quietly between them. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Emmett continued. Fear isn't weakness. Luke looked up. The old man wasn't talking about dogs anymore. Sometimes fear just means something important matters to you. Luke remained silent. Emmett continued watching the distant field. Rusty paid attention to everything. He noticed things other dogs missed. He trusted carefully. Once he gave that trust, he never took it back. A warm memory seemed to soften his face. So, I asked for more time. Did they give it to you? Barely. Luke smiled. I guess that means they didn't think much of your idea. They definitely didn't. For the first time, Emmett laughed. A genuine laugh, short but real. Luke found himself smiling too. Over the following months, according to Emmett, he worked with Rusty almost every day. Not because the dog was learning faster than the others, because he wasn't. Progress came slowly. Some days it felt like there was no progress at all. Rusty would become nervous during exercises. He struggled with confidence drills. Training setbacks happened regularly. Yet Emmett kept showing up, day after day, week after week, month after month. What made you keep trying? Luke asked. The old man thought about the question. Then he gave an answer Luke would remember for a long time. Because somebody should. The simplicity of the response struck him. No grand speech, no dramatic explanation, just 4 words. Because somebody should. Emmett took another sip of coffee. There were times when I thought they might be right. Luke blinked. You did? Of course. The admission surprised him. You doubted Rusty? I doubted myself. The old man looked out across the empty field. Believing in someone doesn't mean you never have doubts. That sentence landed differently. Luke lowered his eyes. He understood that feeling better than he wanted to admit. Since his mother's death, doubt had followed him everywhere. Doubt about himself. Doubt about his future. Doubt about whether he would ever feel normal again. Emmett continued. One day something changed. Luke immediately leaned forward. What? Rusty stopped trying to become the dog everyone wanted him to be. The answer wasn't what he expected. The old man smiled. He started becoming himself. Luke frowned slightly. I don't understand. You will. Emmett's voice remained gentle. Some dogs aren't built to lead a charge through a door. He looked directly at Luke. But that doesn't mean they have nothing to offer. The afternoon sunlight faded behind a layer of clouds. A few leaves drifted across the training field. For several moments neither spoke. Luke found himself thinking about Rusty, a nervous dog, a dog nobody believed in, a dog people wanted to remove. Yet somehow he had become important enough to still be remembered decades later. That thought stayed with him. Finally, he looked back toward Emmett. Did Rusty know you believed in him? The old man's eyes softened. I think so. How? Emmett smiled. Because he believed in me, too. Neither said anything after that. The silence felt comfortable. As the afternoon grew colder, Luke helped carry a toolbox back toward the maintenance shed. Halfway there, he stopped walking. Emmett looked back. You okay? Luke nodded slowly, but his voice sounded different when he answered, quieter, more honest. I think I understand Rusty. The old man waited. Luke looked down at the gravel beneath his shoes. For months he had carried thoughts he rarely shared. Now the words came naturally. Sometimes it feels like everyone expects me to be doing better than I am. Emmett didn't interrupt. Sometimes I feel like I'm disappointing people. The old man remained silent, listening. That was all. And somehow it helped. Luke finally looked up. A small, uncertain smile appeared on his face. I guess Rusty probably felt that way too. Emmett studied him for a moment. Then he nodded. Maybe he did. As they continued walking toward the maintenance shed, Luke realized something important. The story wasn't really about a dog, not entirely. It was about what happens when somebody believes in you before you've learned how to believe in yourself. And for the first time since losing his mother, Luke no longer felt quite as alone. The story of Rusty stayed with Wade Brennan long after Luke shared what Emmett had told him. At first, Wade had been curious about the old maintenance worker because of Jasper and Bandit's strange reaction. Now that curiosity had become something deeper. Every answer seemed to uncover two new questions. Who had Emmett really been? And why had someone with so much influence on Pine Ridge K9 Training Center become almost invisible? One rainy afternoon, after finishing a training session, Wade sat alone in his office reviewing the growing collection of documents he had gathered over the previous weeks. Training manuals, evaluation reports, development proposals, and old photographs covered his desk. One pattern continued appearing. Emmett's name showed up repeatedly in early records. Then, almost suddenly, it disappeared. Yet the work itself never disappeared. The techniques remained. The systems remained. The training philosophy remained. Only the name behind much of it seemed to vanish. That realization pushed Wade to make a series of phone calls. Over the next several days, he contacted retired officers who had worked at Pine Ridge decades earlier. Some remembered little. Others remembered more than they initially wanted to discuss. One of those former officers was Frank Delaney, a 78-year-old retired K9 supervisor living outside Helena, Montana. Frank had served at Pine Ridge during the same years Emmett worked there. Wade arranged a video call. The old supervisor appeared on screen, sitting in a small home office lined with photographs and plaques from his law enforcement career. When Wade showed him Emmett's photograph, Frank immediately recognized him. That's Emmett Grady. You knew him well? Frank nodded. Everybody knew him back then. The answer sounded familiar. Wade had heard variations of it several times already. What kind of reputation did he have? Frank smiled. The kind you earn. He paused. Most people wanted to work with the successful dogs. Wade listened carefully. Emmett worked with the difficult ones. The statement reminded him instantly of Rusty. "What happened to him?" Wade asked. The smile disappeared from Frank's face. A long silence followed. Then the retired supervisor sighed. "Politics happened." Wade leaned forward slightly. "What do you mean?" Frank looked uncomfortable, as if he had spent years avoiding the subject. Back then, the center was growing fast. New funding, new facilities, more attention from the state. And people wanted recognition. The answer came quietly. Wade already knew where the conversation was heading. Vernon Pierce. Frank nodded. Captain Vernon Pierce had long been celebrated as one of the architects of Pine Ridge's success. His name appeared in brochures. His portrait hung in the administration building. Young handlers still learned about his contributions during orientation. "What role did he actually play?" Wade asked. Frank chose his words carefully. "He helped build the program." The answer sounded fair. Then the retired supervisor added something else. But he wasn't the only one. The room became quiet. Wade waited. Eventually, Frank continued. "Emmett developed many of the training systems that made Pine Ridge successful. He spent years refining methods, testing ideas, working with dogs others had given up on." The old supervisor looked directly into the camera. Then the public recognition started coming. Wade already knew what came next. Vernon got the credit. Frank nodded slowly. Most of it. The words landed heavily. For several moments, neither man spoke. Finally, Wade asked the question he had been carrying for weeks. "Did Emmett ever fight it?" The retired supervisor smiled sadly. "No." "Why not?" "Because he cared more about the dogs than the spotlight." That answer felt painfully believable. After the call ended, Wade sat quietly in his office. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Inside, a picture of Emmett's life was beginning to emerge, not all at once, piece by piece. The more Wade learned, the more he respected the old man. Yet another question remained unanswered. How had someone moved from helping build Pine Ridge to repairing fences around it? The answer arrived from another retired officer. Martha Collins, age 71, had served as an administrative coordinator during the center's expansion years. She remembered details many others had forgotten. Unlike the others, she spoke openly. "Emmett never cared about awards," she told Wade over the phone. "But his family did." The statement caught his attention immediately. "What family?" "His wife." Martha paused. "They were good people." Wade listened carefully. Long hours eventually became longer. Recognition went elsewhere. Frustrations built. She sighed. "I don't think the credit was what hurt him most." "What was?" "He stopped believing his work mattered." The answer lingered in Wade's thoughts long after the conversation ended. For years, Emmett had invested himself in building something important. Then he watched others receive recognition, while his contributions slowly faded from view. The disappointment wasn't sudden. It happened gradually, year after year. Eventually, Emmett left the profession, not dramatically, not publicly. He simply walked away. According to Martha, the marriage did not survive the years that followed. Nobody seemed to know exactly what happened, only that Emmett eventually found himself living alone, working small jobs, keeping mostly to himself. The story felt less like a scandal and more like a quiet tragedy. A man who had given everything to a profession, then lost almost everything in return. Several days later, Wade found himself watching Emmett again from across the training grounds. The old man was repairing a damaged kennel door. The work was simple, the same kind of work he performed every day. Yet now, Wade saw it differently. He no longer saw an ordinary maintenance worker. He saw someone who had once helped build the very place around him, someone who had been forgotten, or perhaps allowed himself to be forgotten. The thought stayed with Wade through the remainder of the week. Then an unexpected phone call changed everything. The call came from Harold Simmons, the retired K9 handler Wade had spoken with earlier. Harold sounded unusually serious. "I found something." Wade immediately sat up. "What is it?" A pause followed. Then Harold lowered his voice. "There are still records nobody ever looked at." Wade frowned. "What kind of records?" "Old storage files." Another pause. "Some of them were never opened after the archives were moved." Wade felt his pulse quicken. Where are they? In a county storage facility outside Billings. Harold hesitated. If those files contain what I think they contain, they may finally explain what happened all those years ago. Wade stared through the office window toward the distant training fields where Emmett continued working, completely unaware of the conversation taking place. For the first time, Wade felt certain the truth was still out there. Waiting, buried beneath decades of dust. And somewhere inside those forgotten records might be the answers that had remained hidden for more than 30 years. The discovery of the unopened archive files stayed in Wade Brennan's mind for days, but before making the trip to examine them, he wanted to understand something else first. The question that had started everything. Why had Jasper and Bandit reacted so strongly to Emmett Grady? The answer, Wade suspected, was somewhere inside the history of Pine Ridge itself. Late one evening, after most of the handlers had gone home, Wade sat alone inside the administration building, surrounded by stacks of old training materials. Dust-covered binders filled the conference table. Some were so old that their pages had begun to yellow with age. He opened another folder from the archive collection. Then another, and another. Hours passed. The deeper he searched, the clearer the pattern became. One training guide led to another. One lesson plan referenced an earlier manual. One communication system evolved from a previous version. Again and again, he found the same name, Emmett Grady. The realization slowly settled over him. The modern K9 program had not appeared overnight. It had been built layer by layer over decades, and much of its foundation traced back to the same quiet maintenance worker everyone had ignored. Wade eventually located the oldest surviving instructor manual in the center's records. The cover was badly worn. The binding had nearly come apart. Across the front, faded letters identified it as an early handler communication guide. He opened it carefully. Several pages contained detailed sketches of hand signals. Some directed movement. Others controlled positioning. A few allowed silent communication during search operations. Wade studied them one by one, then he stopped. His eyes fixed on a single illustration. The signal looked familiar. Very familiar. His pulse quickened. It was the same gesture Emmett had used on the day Jasper and Bandit broke formation. Wade immediately flipped back through his notes. There was no mistake. The old hand signal still existed inside the training system. Not exactly in its original form. It had been modified over the years, refined, updated. But the roots were unmistakable. For several seconds, Wade simply stared at the page. A strange feeling settled over him. The answer had been sitting in front of everyone all along. Jasper and Bandit had not reacted because they personally knew Emmett. That would have been impossible. Neither dog had ever met him before. But they recognized something else. The language. The same communication system that shaped their training. The same signals passed down through generations of handlers. The same foundation Emmett had helped create decades earlier. The realization changed everything. The dogs had not been responding to a stranger. In a way, they had been responding to a familiar voice. A voice that had never truly disappeared. The next morning, Wade walked onto the training field carrying copies of the old manuals. Jasper and Bandit were working through obedience exercises with their handlers. As he watched them move through the commands, he began noticing connections everywhere, tiny details, subtle movements. Patterns hidden inside modern techniques. The legacy remained. Most people simply did not know where it came from. Wade looked toward the maintenance building. Emmett was replacing a damaged section of fencing. The old man worked quietly, completely unaware of the discovery that had just been made. For a moment, Wade considered walking over and telling him. Instead, he stayed where he was. Something told him the conversation could wait. Meanwhile, Luke Brennan continued finding reasons to visit the center more often. At first, Wade assumed his son came to see the dogs. Soon he realized the real reason. Luke was coming to see Emmett. Their friendship had grown naturally over the previous weeks. Neither seemed to force it. The old man never treated Luke differently because of his age. Luke never treated Emmett like a fragile elderly man. Somehow, they met each other as equals. One Saturday afternoon, they sat together beside the puppy training area. Several young German Shepherd recruits were chasing toys across a fenced exercise yard. The sight made Luke laugh. It was a sound Emmett had begun hearing more often. "You know," Emmett said quietly, "that one reminds me of Rusty." Luke pointed toward a clumsy puppy tumbling over its own feet. "That one?" "Exactly." Luke laughed again. Rusty wasn't graceful either? Not even close. The old man's eyes filled with amusement. He once ran directly into a training barrel. Luke nearly doubled over laughing. What happened? He knocked himself backward and acted like the barrel attacked him. The image was so unexpected that both of them laughed together. For a few moments, neither thought about grief, neither thought about loss. They simply enjoyed the story. The moment felt surprisingly important, because for Luke, happiness had become rare, and for Emmett, companionship had become rare. Without realizing it, they were helping each other heal. As the afternoon continued, they walked through the kennel area, checking water bowls and helping a handler prepare equipment for the following day. Several dogs greeted Emmett enthusiastically, not because they knew his history, simply because dogs tended to like him. Luke noticed that. Why do they always come to you? Emmett smiled. I asked them how they're doing. Luke raised an eyebrow. You talk to them? Of course. They can't answer? The old man looked amused. Sure they can? Luke shook his head. No, they can't. Emmett pointed toward a nearby German shepherd wagging its tail. Looks like an answer to me. Luke laughed. The conversation continued as they worked. Simple topics, nothing dramatic. Yet each discussion seemed to make the distance between them smaller. For the first time in years, Emmett found himself looking forward to seeing someone. And for the first time since losing his mother, Luke felt genuinely comfortable somewhere outside his home. Later that evening, the sky above Kalispell turned gold as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. Most of the facility had emptied. Only a few handlers remained. Luke sat on a fence rail watching Jasper and Bandit complete a final training exercise. The dogs moved flawlessly, confident, focused, disciplined, the same dogs that had caused chaos weeks earlier. Emmett stood nearby gathering tools. Luke watched him for several moments. Then he spoke. His voice was quieter than usual, more sincere. Can I tell you something? Emmett looked up. Sure. Luke hesitated. For a second he seemed uncertain. Then he took a breath. You're the only reason I want to come here. The words surprised even him. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable silence. The kind that arrives when something honest has finally been said. Emmett lowered the toolbox slowly. For a moment, emotion flickered across his face. He looked away toward the training field. Then back at Luke. A gentle smile appeared, one that carried gratitude, sadness, and warmth all at once. That means a lot, kid. Luke smiled. Neither said anything else. They didn't need to, because both understood the truth hidden inside those simple words. Sometimes healing begins long before anyone realizes it. Winter arrived gradually in Kalispell, Montana. The mornings became colder. Frost lingered longer on the training fields, and the mountains surrounding Pine Ridge K9 Training Center disappeared more often behind low clouds and drifting snow. Life at the facility continued as usual. Handlers trained dogs. Vehicles came and went. New recruits entered the program. Yet beneath the routine, small changes were taking place. Changes that few people noticed at first. One of them involved Emmett Grady. The old maintenance worker still arrived before sunrise each morning. He still repaired broken gates, replaced worn equipment, and checked the kennel fences before most employees arrived. But Wade Brennan had started paying closer attention. Once you begin looking for something, it becomes harder to ignore. One morning, Wade watched from across the yard as Emmett attempted to unlock a maintenance shed. The key slipped from his fingers. It hit the ground. The old man bent down to retrieve it. For a brief moment, Wade noticed something unusual. Emmett's hand was shaking, not from the cold. The movement continued even after he picked up the key. The tremor lasted only a few seconds before disappearing. At first, Wade told himself it meant nothing. People aged, hands shook. But over the following weeks, he noticed similar moments. A wrench slipping unexpectedly, a coffee cup requiring both hands, a slight hesitation before fastening a bolt. Individually, the incident seemed insignificant. Together, they painted a different picture. The concern stayed with Wade until one afternoon when he happened to run into Dr. Karen Whitmore, a 62-year-old neurologist who occasionally volunteered with therapy, dog programs connected to local law enforcement. Karen had known Emmett for years through community events. During a casual conversation, Wade mentioned the tremors. The doctor's expression changed immediately. Not dramatically, just enough for Wade to notice. "You've seen it too?" she asked quietly. Wade nodded. Karen hesitated. Then she chose her words carefully. "Emmett doesn't advertise it." A silence followed. "What is it?" Wade asked. The answer came softly. "Early-stage Parkinson's." Wade felt his stomach tighten. For several seconds he simply stared at her. The diagnosis explained everything: the trembling hands, the occasional stiffness, the subtle changes he had been noticing. "What does he know?" Wade asked. Karen looked at him. "He knows." The words hit harder than Wade expected, because that meant Emmett had been carrying the burden alone. That evening, Wade remained in his office long after everyone else had left. The training center had grown quiet. Snow drifted gently outside the windows. His thoughts kept returning to Emmett. For weeks, Wade had been investigating the old man's past. Now he suddenly found himself thinking about the future. Or, more specifically, how much future remained. The following afternoon, he approached Emmett near the maintenance garage. The old man was organizing tools inside a cabinet. For a while, neither spoke. Then Wade finally broke the silence. "You could have told me." Emmett paused, only briefly. Then he continued arranging the tools. "Told you what?" "About Parkinson's." The cabinet door remained open. The old man stood motionless. Eventually he sighed. "I was wondering when somebody would figure it out." There was no anger in his voice, no self-pity, only acceptance. Wade stepped closer. "How long have you known?" "A little over 2 years." The answer surprised him. 2 years? Emmett nodded. "Long enough?" The silence that followed felt heavy. Finally, Wade asked the question that mattered most. "Why are you still working here?" For the first time, Emmett looked directly at him. His eyes were calm, honest, and tired. "Because I wanted one last chance." The answer confused Wade. "A last chance at what?" The old man glanced toward the training fields beyond the garage. Several dogs were running exercises in the distance. His expression softened. To be around them. Wade didn't need clarification. The dogs, the program, the world that had once defined his life. Emmett folded his arms slowly. "When the diagnosis came, I started thinking about time differently." His voice remained steady. "I knew there would come a day when my hands wouldn't cooperate anymore." He looked down briefly. "Maybe a day when I couldn't even give a proper hand signal." The words carried more sadness than anything Wade had heard from him before. "I didn't come back looking for recognition." His eyes moved toward the training field again. "I just wanted to spend a little more time around K9s before that day arrived." Wade listened quietly. For once, he had no response. No solution, no advice, only understanding. Meanwhile, another person had begun noticing the changes too. Luke Brennan. The realization came unexpectedly one afternoon. He had stopped by the maintenance shed after school to help Emmett replace a damaged latch. The work was simple, nothing unusual. Then it happened. As Emmett reached for a cup of coffee sitting nearby, his hand began trembling. The cup rattled against the workbench. Coffee splashed over the rim. The old man quickly steadied it with his other hand. But the moment had already happened. Luke saw everything. For several seconds he said nothing. Neither did Emmett. The silence felt different this time. Heavier, more fragile. That evening, Luke sat alone in his room thinking about what he had seen. A memory surfaced. His mother's hands during her final year, the exhaustion, the weakness, the gradual changes everyone pretended not to notice. Fear settled quietly inside him. Not because he fully understood Parkinson's, because he understood loss. He understood what it felt like when someone important started slipping away. A few days later, Luke and Emmett sat together near the kennel yard after most employees had gone home. The winter air felt sharp. The dogs had settled for the evening. Neither spoke for a while. Then Luke broke the silence. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." Luke stared toward the kennels. His voice was softer than usual. "Do you ever get scared?" Emmett looked at him carefully. "I think everybody does." Luke nodded slowly. Then he surprised himself by saying what had been bothering him for months. "My dad doesn't smile anymore." The words hung in the cold air. Neither of them noticed Wade standing nearby on the opposite side of the kennel building. He had been heading toward the parking lot. Now he stopped, unseen, listening. Luke continued. He used to. The teenager looked down, but not now. Emmett remained silent, allowing him to continue. He's always working? Luke swallowed. I think he's sad all the time. Those words struck Wade harder than any accusation ever could, because they were true. The old man beside Luke finally spoke. Sometimes people get hurt in ways nobody can see. Luke nodded. My dad misses my mom. So do you. The teenager's eyes filled with emotion. Neither tried to hide it. Across the yard, Wade remained frozen in place. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about Emmett, or Rusty, or the old files. He was thinking about himself, about all the grief he had buried beneath schedules, training exercises, and endless work. For 2 years, he had focused on helping everyone except himself. And somewhere along the way, he had stopped healing. As darkness settled over Pine Ridge, Wade quietly turned and walked toward the parking lot. For the first time, he realized he carried wounds that had never truly healed. 3 days after the conversation outside the kennels, Wade Brennan drove east before sunrise. Snow covered much of the highway leading toward Billings. The mountains stood silent beneath a pale winter sky, while long stretches of road disappeared into frozen fields. The trip had only one purpose: the unopened archive files. For weeks, the mystery surrounding Emmett Grady had grown larger with every discovery. Training manuals, forgotten photographs, testimonies from retired officers, pieces of a story that never seemed complete. Now Wade hoped to find the missing piece. The county storage facility sat on the edge of an industrial district outside town. The building was old, windowless, and filled with rows of shelving that stretched deep into the warehouse. Harold Simmons was already waiting. The 72-year-old retired K9 handler stood beside a rolling cart stacked with dusty boxes. You made good time, Harold said. Wade nodded. You said you found something. Harold rested his hand on one of the boxes. I think this is what we've been looking for. For the next several hours, they sorted through decades of forgotten paperwork, personnel records, training reports, budget documents, old correspondence. Most of it revealed nothing new. Then, shortly after noon, Wade opened a narrow archive box containing incident reports from the late 1980s. A faded folder slid onto the table. The label immediately caught his attention. Search and Rescue Operation. January 14th, 1988. Wade felt his pulse quicken. The date matched the period when Rusty had served with Emmett. Carefully, he opened the folder. Inside were dozens of pages. Weather reports, witness statements, radio transcripts, mission summaries. As he read, the story slowly emerged. A severe winter storm had struck northern Montana. Heavy snow, strong winds, dangerous temperatures. During the storm, an 8-year-old boy named Michael Turner had disappeared from his family's rural property. The child had wandered into the wilderness shortly before conditions became life-threatening. Search teams spent hours looking for him. Nothing. Visibility deteriorated. Temperatures continued falling. The situation grew increasingly desperate. Then Emmett and Rusty were deployed. Wade continued reading. The report described Rusty's actions in remarkable detail. Despite difficult conditions, the German Shepherds successfully located a scent trail. For hours, dog and handler pushed deeper into the storm. Snowdrifts reached dangerous heights. Several members of the search team recommended suspending operations until daylight. Emmett refused, not recklessly, not stubbornly. He simply trusted Rusty. The report noted that the dog remained focused despite worsening weather. Eventually, Rusty located the missing child nearly 3 miles from the original search area. The boy was unconscious, severely hypothermic, but alive. Wade turned the page. His breathing slowed. This was the moment he had been searching for. The section describing Rusty's death. For over 30 years, Emmett had carried the belief that his decision had cost his partner's life. Wade already knew that much. The question was whether the records supported that belief. He continued reading. The answer appeared almost immediately. And it changed everything. Rusty had not died because of a mistake. He had not died because Emmett pushed him too far. The official investigation reached a completely different conclusion. After locating the child, Rusty remained beside him while rescuers prepared evacuation equipment. The dog continued working until the mission was complete. Only afterward did he begin showing signs of severe physical exhaustion, caused by prolonged exposure to the storm. Medical efforts were attempted. They failed. Rusty died after the child had already been rescued, after the mission had already succeeded, after his job was done. Wade sat silently staring at the page. The truth was sitting directly in front of him. For more than 30 years, Emmett had blamed himself for something that had never happened. The next document nearly brought Wade to tears. It was the final review issued by the investigation board. A single paragraph stood highlighted near the conclusion. He read it twice, then a third time. The statement was clear, unequivocal, official. If not for Officer Emmett Grady and K9 Rusty, the victim would not have survived. Wade slowly lowered the page. Across the table, Harold remained silent. The older man already understood the significance of what had been found. He never knew, Wade said quietly. Harold shook his head. No. He spent 3 decades believing he failed. I know. Neither spoke for several moments. The warehouse felt strangely quiet, as though even the building understood the weight of the discovery. That evening, Wade returned to Kalispell carrying copies of every relevant document. He didn't wait. The moment he arrived at Pine Ridge, he went looking for Emmett. The old man was alone inside the maintenance workshop. A small heater hummed softly in the corner. Tools lined the walls. Outside, snow continued falling. Emmett looked up when Wade entered. You look serious. Wade closed the door behind him. I found the files. The old man's expression changed immediately. Not fear, not anticipation. Something closer to resignation. For years he had avoided reopening that chapter of his life. Now it had finally caught up with him. Wade placed the folder on the workbench. Neither man spoke. Slowly Emmett opened it. The pages trembled slightly in his hands. Whether from age, Parkinson's, or emotion, Wade could not tell. For nearly 20 minutes, the old man read in silence. The workshop remained completely still. Page after page, report after report. Every detail, every finding, every conclusion. Eventually, Emmett reached the final review. His eyes stopped moving. He stared at the highlighted sentence. The one he had never seen. The one that should have reached him decades earlier. If not for Officer Emmett Grady and K9 Rusty, the victim would not have survived. For a long time, nothing happened. Then Emmett lowered the paper. His shoulders sagged, as though a weight he had carried for half a lifetime had finally slipped away. Tears filled his eyes. The old man looked down at the report again, then covered his mouth with one trembling hand. Wade quietly turned away. Some moments deserved privacy. Emmett wasn't crying because Rusty had died. He had mourned that loss 30 years earlier. He was crying because the guilt was finally gone. The guilt that had followed him through every season of his life. The guilt that had survived retirement, divorce, loneliness, illness, all of it. Gone. For several minutes, only silence filled the room. Eventually, Emmett spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. He did it. Wade looked back. The old man smiled through tears. That stubborn dog actually did it. More tears followed. But these felt different. Lighter. Cleaner. Like rain after a long drought. For the first time in more than 3 decades, Emmett Grady no longer saw himself as the man who lost Rusty. He finally saw himself as Rusty's partner, and for the first time since that terrible winter storm, he forgave himself. The snow continued falling across Kalispell during the weeks that followed. Life at Pine Ridge K9. Training Center appeared normal from the outside. Training schedules continued. Handlers worked with their dogs. New recruits entered the program. Yet beneath the routine, something important was happening. For the first time in decades, the center's leadership had begun reviewing its own history. The process started quietly. Wade Brennan spent countless hours gathering documents from the archives. He compared reports, training manuals, operational records, photographs, and witness statements. The deeper he looked, the clearer the truth became. Emmett Grady's contributions had never disappeared. They had simply been buried beneath years of incomplete records and misplaced recognition. And Rusty's story had suffered the same fate. One afternoon, Wade sat inside the conference room with several members of the center's leadership committee. The evidence covered the table. No dramatic arguments were needed. The documents spoke for themselves. Training systems still in use today could be traced directly back to Emmett's original work. The search and rescue report proved the truth about Rusty's final mission. Retired officers had provided supporting testimony. The facts were impossible to ignore. When the meeting ended, the decision was unanimous. The historical records would be corrected, not partially, completely. For Wade, the decision felt overdue by more than 30 years. For Emmett, it felt unreal. When Wade first told him, the old man simply stared in silence. They were standing beside the kennel yard as the afternoon sun dipped toward the mountains. "You don't have to do this," Emmett said quietly. Wade smiled. "We do." The old man looked away. His eyes settled on the dogs training in the distance. For a moment, he seemed unsure what to say. Then he shook his head. "I never expected any of this." "I know." The conversation ended there. Neither man needed to say more. A few days later, invitations were sent. Handlers, retired officers, community members, former K9 partners, current staff. The gathering would be held inside the main training auditorium. Officially, it was described as a historical recognition ceremony. Unofficially, everyone knew it was about something much bigger. The morning of the event arrived cold and clear. The sky above Montana stretched bright and blue. By noon, the auditorium was full. Rows of chairs filled the room. Police officers sat beside retired handlers. Families occupied the back rows. Several current K9 teams rested quietly near the stage. Among the audience sat Luke Brennan. The 13-year-old had insisted on arriving early. He wore a pressed shirt and spent most of the morning looking toward the entrance, waiting. Eventually, Emmett arrived. The old man seemed uncomfortable with the attention. He still wore the same modest jacket he had worn countless times before. Nothing about him suggested he was the reason hundreds of people had gathered. Yet, as he entered the room, conversations gradually faded. People turned. Some recognized his name. Others knew only fragments of the story. But all of them understood that something important was about to happen. Wade stepped onto the stage. For a moment, he simply looked across the audience. Then he began speaking. He talked about the early years of Pine Ridge, the challenges of building a successful K9 program, the officers and handlers who had helped shape its future. Then he spoke about forgotten contributions, forgotten sacrifices, forgotten names. The room remained completely silent. Next came the documents. Photographs appeared on large screens, training manuals, historical reports, pictures of young handlers and young dogs from decades earlier. Among them was the photograph Wade had first discovered months before, a young Emmett standing beside Rusty. Several people in the audience wiped their eyes. Others simply watched quietly. Then Wade reached the most important part. "The history of this center," he said, "has not always been complete." His voice remained steady. "But today, we correct that." The words echoed through the auditorium. One by one, he explained Emmett's contributions, the development of training systems, communication methods, behavior evaluation programs, foundational work that still influenced every K9 team operating at Pine Ridge. Then he spoke about Rusty. The room listened as the details of the 1988 rescue mission were finally shared. The snowstorm, the missing child, the successful search, the sacrifice. When Wade read the final line from the official report, many people lowered their heads. If not for Officer Emmett Grady and K9 Rusty, the victim would not have survived. For several seconds, nobody moved. The sentence seemed to settle over the room like a quiet prayer. Then Wade looked toward Emmett. "The records have been updated." The old man remained seated, almost frozen. As of today, both names have been restored to their rightful place in the history of Pine Ridge. The applause began slowly. A few people stood, then more, then nearly everyone. Within moments, the entire auditorium was on its feet. The standing ovation continued, longer than Emmett expected, longer than Wade expected. The old man lowered his head. His eyes glistened. For decades, he had lived without recognition. Now hundreds of people were honoring not only him, but also the dog he had loved, the dog he had carried in his heart for more than 30 years. Across the room, Luke felt his own eyes growing wet. He didn't try to hide it, because he wasn't watching a ceremony. He was watching someone finally receive the truth. The applause continued. Then something happened that nobody had planned. Luke stood. Without hesitation, he moved through the crowd, past the rows of chairs, past the officers, past the handlers. He walked directly toward Emmett. The old man looked up in surprise. Before he could react, Luke wrapped his arms around him. The auditorium became quiet again. Not because the applause had ended, because the moment meant something deeper. Emmett gently placed one hand on the boy's shoulder. Neither spoke, neither needed to. The embrace lasted only a few seconds, yet it carried years of loneliness, grief, gratitude, and healing. From the stage, Wade watched everything unfold. His attention was not on the audience, not on the applause, not even on Emmett. It was on Luke. For the first time in years, his son was smiling. Not politely, not briefly. A genuine smile, the kind Wade thought had disappeared forever after his wife's death. The sight struck him harder than anything else that day, because in that moment, he understood something. While he had spent months trying to help Emmett reclaim the past, something else had happened. Luke had started healing, and perhaps he had too. As the ceremony came to an end and people gathered around Emmett to offer congratulations, Wade remained standing quietly near the stage. His eyes followed his son across the room. For 2 years he had hidden from his grief inside work, inside schedules, inside responsibilities. But now he saw clearly what it had cost. He saw the distance that had grown between him and Luke, and for the first time, he decided that distance needed to end. Because some wounds heal only when we finally stop pretending they are gone. The morning of the dedication ceremony arrived clear and golden over Kalispell, Montana. Snow still rested on the distant mountain ridges, but the sky above Pine Ridge K9 Training Center had opened into a soft winter blue. The new training field stood beyond the main kennel yard, quiet and freshly prepared, waiting for the first footsteps of the day. For years, the back section of Pine Ridge had been little more than an open stretch of ground used for temporary exercises. Now, it had been rebuilt with new fencing, fresh gravel paths, agility equipment, and a wide training area designed for young K9 teams. At the entrance stood a covered sign, hidden beneath a large dark cloth. Emmett Grady arrived early, just as he always had. At 74, Emmett was still the same quiet man many people had once overlooked. He wore a simple jacket, carried himself with careful dignity, and moved with the slow steadiness of someone who had learned to respect the limits of his body. But that morning, there was something different in the way people looked at him. They no longer saw only a maintenance worker. They saw the man who had helped shape Pine Ridge. They saw the partner of Rusty. Lieutenant Wade Brennan, 44 years old and director of the K9 training program, stood near the field entrance with his son, Luke. Wade had spent the past weeks making changes, not only in the center, but in his own life. He left the office earlier. He made dinner at home more often. He listened when Luke spoke, even when the conversation was small. Healing had not arrived like thunder. It had arrived like sunrise, slowly and quietly, one honest moment at a time. Luke Brennan, 13 years old, stood beside his father with a calm expression Wade had not seen in a long while. The boy still carried grief. He still missed his mother. Some losses never fully disappear, but he no longer seemed trapped inside that grief. He had found a place at Pine Ridge, and, more importantly, he had found someone who made him feel understood. That someone was Emmett. When Luke saw the old man walking toward them, he smiled and hurried forward. "Morning, Mr. Grady." Emmett looked at him with warmth. "Morning, kid." Luke glanced at the covered sign. "Are you nervous?" Emmett looked at the crowd gathering near the field. Handlers, officers, retired K9 partners, local officials, and families had all come to witness the dedication. Jasper and Bandit sat nearby, with their handlers, calm and alert, as if they knew the day mattered. "Maybe a little," Emmett admitted. Luke grinned. "Rusty would probably tell you to stand up straight." The old man blinked, then gave a soft laugh. "He probably would." The small joke loosened something in Emmett's chest. For most of his life, Rusty's name had lived in silence, locked away with guilt and sorrow. Now, a 13-year-old boy could speak it freely beneath an open sky. that alone felt like a miracle. Wade stepped forward and placed a hand gently on Luke's shoulder. "You ready?" he asked Emmett. Emmett looked at the covered sign. For a moment, he did not answer. He remembered another morning, more than 30 years earlier. Snow, wind, Rusty's body pressing forward through the storm. The desperate hope of finding a lost child before the cold took him. For decades, that memory had ended in blame. Now, it ended differently. It ended with truth. Rusty had not failed. Emmett had not failed. They had done what partners do. They had trusted each other until the very end. "I'm ready," Emmett said. The ceremony began without grand speeches. Wade had chosen simplicity because he knew Emmett would prefer it that way. A few words were spoken about service, loyalty, and the bond between handlers and dogs. Wade spoke about the future of Pine Ridge and the young teams who would train on this field for years to come. Then his voice grew quieter. "This field is not being named only for history," Wade said. "It is being named for what history almost forgot. It is being named for a man who believed in dogs others had given up on, and for a dog who proved that courage does not always begin with strength. Sometimes it begins with trust." The crowd fell still. Wade turned toward Emmett. "Officer Emmett Grady and K9. Rusty helped build the heart of this program. Today, Pine Ridge makes sure that heart is never forgotten again." Two officers stepped forward and took hold of the cloth covering the sign. For a breath, everything seemed to pause. Then the cloth came down. The words appeared in clean, dark letters against polished wood. "Grady and Rusty Training Field." Emmett did not move, his eyes fixed on the sign. At first his face showed only surprise, as if some part of him had expected his own name, but not Rusty's. Then his expression changed. His lips trembled, his eyes filled, tears slid down the deep lines of his weathered face. Not because his name had been carved there, because Rusty's had. After more than 30 years, the dog everyone once called too gentle, too nervous, too uncertain, finally stood where he belonged. Not in a forgotten report, not in a dusty photograph, not only in the memory of one old man who had loved him. Rusty belonged to Pine Ridge again. Emmett took one slow step forward, then another. Luke moved beside him without being asked. Wade followed on his other side. Jasper and Bandit rose from where they sat and came forward as well, calm and quiet, until they settled at Emmett's feet. No one tried to stop them. This time, nobody panicked. This time, everyone understood. Emmett reached the sign and lifted one trembling hand. His fingers touched the carved letters of Rusty's name. The tremor was still there, but it no longer seemed like weakness. It looked like the hand of a man who had carried sorrow for a very long time and had finally been allowed to set it down. The crowd remained silent. Wade looked at Luke. Luke was smiling through tears. That smile gave Wade the answer he had been searching for. He did not need to fix everything at once. He only needed to stay present, to stop hiding behind work, to let his son see that grief could live beside love without swallowing it whole. Wade put an arm around Luke's shoulders. Luke leaned into him. It was a small movement, but for Wade, it felt like coming home. Emmett looked down at Jasper and Bandit. The two German shepherds sat close, steady and noble, as if guarding the moment itself. They had started this journey by breaking formation in front of a frightened crowd. Now they sat beneath a sign that proved they had not caused chaos that day. They had opened a door to truth, a door to healing, a door to family. When the ceremony ended, people approached Emmett one by one. Some shook his hand, some thanked him. A few retired officers apologized for not remembering sooner. Emmett accepted each word with humility, but his eyes kept returning to the sign. Late that afternoon, after the crowd had gone and the field had grown quiet, Emmett returned alone to the entrance. Not completely alone. Wade and Luke stood a short distance behind him, giving him space. Jasper and Bandit remained at his feet. The Montana sun lowered behind the mountains, washing the field in amber light. Emmett placed his palm once more against Rusty's name. For a long moment, he simply stood there. Then he smiled. Not with sadness, not with guilt, with peace. "Well," he whispered, his voice soft enough that only the dogs seemed to hear it. "We made it, old friend." Jasper leaned gently against his leg. Bandit rested his chin near Emmett's boot. The old man looked toward the empty field that would soon train new dogs and new handlers, young lives that would never know how much had been saved before they arrived. Then he touched Rusty's name one final time. "We're home now, buddy." And for the first time in many years, no one standing there felt alone. In the end, this story was never only about two police K9s breaking formation. It was about what happens when the world forgets someone who gave his heart to a purpose bigger than himself. Emmett Grady spent years believing he had failed Rusty, the one partner who had trusted him when no one else did. He lost his place in history, lost his family, and nearly lost faith in the meaning of his own life. Yet the truth had never truly disappeared. It was still there, hidden in old records, in forgotten training methods, and in the silent language that Jasper and Bandit still remembered. Rusty's name being placed beside Emmett's was more than an honor. It was a reminder that every act of loyalty matters, even when no one is watching. Every kind choice leaves a mark. Every life we touch carries part of us forward. Luke learned that grief does not mean love is gone. Wade learned that working harder cannot heal a broken heart if we refuse to face it. And Emmett learned that forgiveness sometimes arrives late, but it can still set a person free. The message of this story is simple but powerful. No one who loves deeply is ever truly forgotten. Sometimes the good we do returns to us years later, not as applause, not as medals, but as a hand on our shoulder, a child's smile, or a loyal dog resting at our feet. What did you think about Emmett, Rusty, Jasper, Bandit, Wade, and Luke's journey? Did any moment in this story touch your heart or remind you of someone you once loved? Please leave your thoughts in the comments below.